So that is the physical seat of thought. What is the source of our emotions, our decision making, our passion, our pains, and everything else? Well, it's the brain, and it's said to be the most complex mechanism in the universe. You might expect, given all it is and given all it does, that look very pretty, full of shimmering lights and glass types and mysterious colors, but in fact it really looks like kind of gross. It looks a 3-day-old method. It's grey, then you take it out of the head, and inside the head it's bright red because of all the blood. In fact, it turned out very surprisingly that the source of our mental life, of our consciousness, is meat. In fact, you can eat it. People have eaten brains. I have the brain with cream sauce, not human brain. Might you buy? I have brain with cream sauce. It's not bad, but it makes the puzzle all the more harder. How can this fleshy thing give rise to mental life? That's the question I want to explore in this lecture and the rest of the lectures. I want to do so by starting with the smallest relevant parts, different parts or neurons, then explore how the neurons are connected together, how they wired up, how they form different subparts of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the frontal lobe. Finally, talking about the brain and the larger perspective, looking at the two halves of the brain, the left half and right half, and how they interact. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the brain, a lot of chemical stuff, a lot of different parts, but where the action is, the part that does the thinking, the part that is the focus of the most research, is the nerves. It's not an accident they call the study of the biological basis of thought nascence, because it all comes from the neurons. So you can see here pictures of neurons interacting together. Here's a diagram that depicts a typal neuron. So that you see is the dendrites, and dendrites receive signals from other nerves, either excitatory like pluses or inhibitory minuses. Then they get to the cell body, which sums up these pluses and minuses, and then you reach a certain threshold, a certain amount of pluses, there's neural firing. Firing takes place toward the axon, and the axon is much longer than the dendrites. In fact, for some modern neurons, it's very long indeed. There are axons running from our spinal cord all the way to your big toe. You could think of it of the relative size of things in terms is of a basketball and 40-mile garden hose. Surrounding the axon is that's called a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is, you can think of it as insulation. It's fatty tissue like insulation on a wire, so the information comes through the dendrites and summed up in the cell body, and it's transmitted through the axon. So that neurons do is they sum up and translate information, and we know that this a lot of them. By some estimates, it's 100 billion, or the estimates tend to be very different and very rough. But there are billions upon billions of neurons, and each connect to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other neurons. So in fact, that you have something of this degree of complexity, this degree of structure which there's no way to replace in any machine. The numbers are just too big. This is why people might describe the brain as the most complicated machine in the universe. At least this is fitting. It's made of maybe which is kind of disappointed. At least it shows its incredible internal structure. So neurons come in three flavors. There are sensory neurons, which take in information from the environment, from the external world. There are smaller neurons, which go from the brain out to your motor control. So if you touch something hot and you feel the pain, the sensory neurons. If you rent your head back or you reach for something, that's motor neurons. Finally, there's interneurons, which connect different neurons without making contact with external world, either through sensation or thought motor action. Now the main thing to think about for neurons and neuron firing is that's all or nothing. It's like firing a gun or sneezing. Neurons either fire or they don't. No, you might think that's a little bit strange, particularly when you think about sensory neurons, because your experience seems to be a continuum. So you have sensory neurons in your eyes and you can distinguish from a very dim light and a very bright light. You have sensory neurons in your finger and you control distinguish between gently touching something versus being stabbed on the tip of your finger or something. But still the neurons are all or nothing. The way we get to this continuity of experience that neurons can code for density in different ways. So one way is in terms of the number of neurons that fire. If X neurons corresponds to a mild experience, X times 10 neurons may correspond to an intense experience. Another factor is the impulse frequency of individual neurons. An individual neurons might denote a mild sensation by going fire, fire, fire. Well, it might denote an dense intuition with fire, 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 fire. So you have neurons and the neurons talk to each other. They talk to each other because an axon of one neuron will communicate with the dendrites or another neuron. A long time ago, people used to think that neurons were wired up together like a computer. But in fact, neurons don't actually touch one another. There is a gap between the axon terminal of one neuron and the dendrite of other one. A very tiny gap, typically of like 1/10,000 of meter wide. This gap is known as synapse. When one neuron fires, the axon releases neurotransmitters. These are chemicals which shoot out over that gap and affect dendrites and other neurons. As I said before, the effect of these neurotransmitters could be excitatory, which is that they raise the energy, so they increase the likelihood of a neuron firing, or inhibitory, so that they bring down the likelihood of a neuron firing. That's interesting. Is that different neurons shoot out different neurotransmitters, so they have different effects on other neurons that they made contact with. In fact, psychopharmacology both attempts to cure various psychological or physical diseases by giving medicines, or recreational psychopharmacology designed to increase pleasure of different forms, sometimes help people work, or help people focus. Works by fiddling with the neurotransmitters, and this can be better antagonists. They lower down intensity of things by building to the dendrites, making it hard to create more neurotransmitters, or they can increase the almost of neurotransmitters available in different ways agonists. You're either pumping up the volume or turning down the volume. So you think about different drugs and their effects. There's curare. Curare is a drug that used by South America Indians. It's antagonists. It blocks motor neurons from affecting their muscle fibers. It keeps your motor neurons from working, and what it doesn't is it paralyzes you. And in a large enough doses, it kills you, because motor neurons also keep your health beating. So shut that down and you die. There's alcohol. Now alcohol also has an inhibitory effect. You might think that's strange because when I drink alcohol I get all excited and happy and goofy. But you have to keep this in mind here. The way alcohol works is it inhibitory part of your brain that does the inhibition. So you have part of your brain that says, don't say that to the other person. Keep your pants on, stop yelling. And alcohol basically inhibits that part of the brain, making you more exuberant. And although the course of things, the course of drinking too much, also inhibits other parts of the brain, so you can pass out and fall off the floor. At large enough doses die. So both curare and alcohol, in different ways, bring things down. The drugs bring things up. So amphetamines, for instance, increased the almost of norepinephrine, which is another neurotransmitter that's responsible for genetic general arousal. And this is how drugs like speed of cocaine work. The drugs like Prozac or L-Dopa influence neurotransmitters in ways that they increase. For instance, the supply of dopamine or serotonin, which can be relevant for just like Parkinson's, which seems to be related to little dopamine, and depression, which is realized to little serotonin. So these drugs work by influencing neurotransmitters, even by directly pumping in more neurotransmitters, or increasing the supply in different ways, or stopping them from having effects by binding them or sucking them up in different ways. But they work through their effects or neurotransmitters. So the more general idea is the way neurons lead to thinking is that they form clusters or networks. These clusters and networks are computational devices that do interesting things like recognize faces, or working up right, or understanding sentences, or doing math, or experiencing great sadness, or falling in love, and so on. Now know that that's possible because we create computing machines that work in certain ways. And if you wire up a computing machine in certain complicated ways, it can do mathematics, play chess, do flight simulator, and so on. So you may be interested in the project of computational neuroscience, which tried to ask the question, how are neurons wired up to do interesting thing, and uses our own success a computational theory as a model, then sometimes takes the interference the other way around, which is can see how people do it, and then use this knowledge of now of how people do it to create computational systems that can do it as well. So how is the brain wired up? Well, you might imagine that it's wired up like a portable computer, like a laptop, like the soft of computer you're looking at now. Into some regard it is, but there's a couple of reasons why it can't be. And both of them have to do with how well the brain works. So first, the brain is hardly resistant to damage. If you get a knife to the brain, you get damage to the brain. It won't typically shut down the whole system. The information and passage somehow distributed across neurons in such a way that makes them extremely resilient to damage. While in contrast, somebody could open up the back of your laptop, pull out the chip, and the whole thing is ruined. The whole thing will stop working. The brain is wired up in a certain ways that makes it highly resilient. The second thing is the brain is wired up in such a way that makes it work very fast. The computers can do millions of operations per second because they're purely electrical. Brain tissue is much slower and can't spend the time to do many steps. So, to put it a different way, if your brain was wired up like a computer, it should be so slow as to be entirely unusable. It has to be wired up in a way that's more efficient, that allows that for the slowness of brain tissues and neurotransmitters and can still compute things at a human level, which is often blindly fast. Because of this, there has been a huge interest in massively parallelized systems and complicated neural networks, which are wired up as we believe the brain does, and as such, we're helping computers to do things based on our understanding of the brain that it could never do before. The details of this is something we're going to talk about throughout the course. We're not actually going to the end up explaining different characteristics directly in terms of neurons. Or how do they recognize faces? We're not going to talk much about neurons in particular, but we'll talk about different brain areas and how they work. And the assumption is that everything we talk about in more functional ways can ultimately reduce down to large networks of neural system, and that in turn will ultimately reduce down to the specific behaviors of the specific neurons that we're looking at.